Well, welcome to the first of the Specimens to Superhuman events, curated by Shape and the Arts Catalyst and supported by the Wellcome Trust. I'm Richard Hollingham. I'm a science reporter for the BBC. I also, though, have another vested interest in this, well, actually two. I've written a book called Blood and Guts, A History of Surgery, so I love hanging out at the Hunterian Museum. But also, my grandmother was an artist, and she had arthritis from her 20s until when she died in her 70s. Unfortunately, and she was a fine artist, very landscapes, beautiful portraits she did. Unfortunately, she died in the 1980s, so pre-internet, so it's as if she never existed. So that's my other vested interest in this event. And we're going to continue the labyrinth of living exhibits with a discussion this evening, hearing more about the performances, first of all, and perhaps what we can learn from them. And here at the Royal College of Surgeons, where better than to talk about how today's medical profession and the doctors and surgeons of the future how they engage with disabled people. And we have two of our living exhibits here on our discussion panel. Artist Aaron Williamson is the curator of the Labyrinth, and he describes his engagement with performance, objects, place and space as being entirely transformed through the experience of becoming profoundly deaf over the course of some 20 years. In the past 10 years, he's created works in Britain, Europe, Japan, Greenland, China, and North America. Then we have Catherine Aranella, who describes her work as a continued investigation and exploration of ways to challenge and subvert representations of physical disability. I think we saw some of that this evening. She says she aims to make works that are humorous and playful with a critical edge. Now, they're joined on the panel by Sam Alberti, who's director of the Hunterian Museum here. He can most definitely be described as an expert in the history of medicine. You'll find that out if you Google his credentials, which actually, that sounds a bit rude when I read that. He's interested in the relationships between museums and universities, and is completing a monograph on the medical museum in Britain. Have you completed it? Yeah, you completed a medical monograph. Yeah, okay. Brian Hurwitz is D'Oyly Carte, a professor of medicine and arts at King's College, London. He's also the director of the Centre for the Humanities and Health. And my first question is going to be in a moment what that all means. He's described the role of the centre as contributing to understanding the subjective inner experience of illness and personal and cultural representations of health and illness. I'm not sure that helps us a huge amount, but we'll come on to that a little later on. So what we're going to do for the next hour or so is we're going to have a chat first with the panelists here, and then we'll take questions, and I'll allow a good quarter of an hour for questions. Now, if you don't feel you are confident enough to ask a question or don't want to ask a question, do grab one of the people with a badge or one of the people with the microphones, and they'll ask the question on your behalf if you don't feel happy. If you want to ask a question, then you will need to be near a microphone. And microphones are being waved now on the, just trying to work out, on the right-hand side as you look at it, as you look at towards me in the lecture theatre. But the microphones will come to you, so do wait. Now, I'm going to start my questions with Aaron. And what were you trying to achieve with this labyrinth of living exhibits?
Well, the achievement was shared between four artists not responsible for what they chose to do. Yeah. By choosing the artists to make work tonight, I am interested in how radical conditions inform people's lives and how they work with that in terms of art. And each of the artists that curated here have experiences of being altered or different from the norm, or have been set apart, if you like, through medical prognosis or through experiences of transformation in one way or another. However, their works are not autobiographical, and nor do they illustrate the social category of disability. Because this is an art event, the challenge was to the audience to interpret the work in an open-ended rather than a programmatic way. What I want to do is give my response to each individual artist and then explain what I was supposed to be doing. Is that okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Start
with Catherine, yeah.
I'll start with Catherine, because I work with Catherine a lot in the disabled avant-garde. And she's very combative, and she challenges the medical model of disability in her work. She resists being defined by a medical diagnosis. And for many years, she was told by medics that she can expect to die at some point. And like the rest of us, obviously. And the medical model of disability is defined, the idea of being defined by impairment. I've collated some examples, which are very typical, taken from an upcoming disability arts festival in Berkeley, in the USA. And these blurbs or descriptions of performances go something like this, which is, they say, talk about Anne, a captivating 10-year-old Dutch girl with Tourette's, Nana, a charismatic young deaf woman, Antoine, an irresistible 5-year-old blind Vietnamese boy, Mark, a young man with autism, Hannah, who has Down syndrome, and so on and so forth. So here we have myself, Aaron, a very witty, charming deaf man, talking about Catherine, a vivacious and elegant woman with something called SMA, was just made a work about in the guise of a guinea pig. And Catherine's work is dark and subversive and sly. The audience's reaction to her depiction of herself as she places herself forward and puts herself in front of the public. Very much the weight of the work, the quantity of the work, is based on how the public respond to her. So here she was a guinea pig escaped from a medical laboratory, and was staged as a cross between the end of the period sideshow and a kind of street living sculpture. Those people who dress up in gold and silver, and you go and see them and they take your money off you and move a little bit. So the experience of people going behind Catherine's hospital screens was, I would imagine, was to ask themselves, are we meant to laugh or are we meant to be horrified? Sinead O'Donnell is from Ireland. Hello, Sinead.
There she is.
and she just washed her nose. And she works with ideas of oppression and suppression, of inequality and injustice. And this piece was called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? And she was attempting to draw out the tiny little electrical spark that lives inside a potato to light a small LSD bulb. So it was a sort of basic scientific system, Irish spuds, pennies and wire, and she used a collection of coins and food to contrast with the colonialist narratives behind the collection of the Ontarian. Those materials told me about poverty, about staple diets, spuds, small coinage and botched science, currency, electrical currency and money currency. It was an experiment, a laboratory experiment. And when I met Sinead earlier, she was talking about she wanted to conduct a voodoo experiment to wake Charles, the Irish giant, from his cage. Now, unfortunately, this experiment failed, so Sinead needs to conduct more research in future. Brian Catlin's piece, I've been aware of Brian's Cyclops piece for 15 years now, and this project began here at the Ontarian in 1979 in response to a specimen known as the Cyclops. It manifested this figure in many of his video work performances and poems, and the one I saw first of all was where he held up a very simple arrangement where he held up a mirror up to his face in order to create reflection that made him look as if he'd got one eye. And that made me think about the objectification of the act of seeing, of watching. The audience looked at him and he looked back at them with one eye. And it makes you think about whether looking back at the world through one pineal eye might somehow be better or more perceptive than having two. You see, this bit is often not about the lack of having something or having something missing. What I thought about in relation to Brian's piece was in imagining a time thousands of years ago when humanity had two heads. And at some point here, one of them was lost, and so we all are sitting pretty and not caring that each of us are lacking a head. My own piece, Leslie. I make work about the process of adjustment from hearing to deafness, and I really value that process. I like being deaf. My life became better for losing my hearing in many different ways. I wasn't cut out for a lot of things that I currently do because I've been able to contextualise my experience and to draw out the value that I put on that process of transformation. So I am affirmative towards my impairment. I don't seek any medical assistance. I threw my hearing aids away many years ago, and I want to continue being deaf. So my piece, I was thinking about the history of the objectification of disabled people in the way that the Antiquarian collection brings to life, in a fascinating way. And I wanted to create a crude arrangement in which the question of the subject and the object became blurred. A very crude, simple arrangement, and some people engaged in it with me by looking through the glass, and some people missed it, and various spontaneous reactions to the fact that this bloke was putting his face up to the glass and sliding down it. Those that did watch me, I felt that they became voyeuristic, and that I was hoping that they would also perceive, if they were observant, their reflection on the glass in return. So there was like three things going on: their reflection on the glass, the specimens within the cases, and then peeping through on the other side of the case was me, looking at them with a squash face. So ultimately I wanted to not only distort my own figure, facial features, but to ask the question of the subject and the object about who is looking at who.
Thank you. I mean, I found your piece particularly disturbing. I don't know why, because maybe that was because when I was looking at you, we were interacting.
When he was looking at me, what? Interacting. I didn't feel a lot of interaction. I do performances where I do feel an interactive element to it. And Sinead, for example, struck up conversations with people who came to a table. But for the purposes of this particular performance, I tried to keep myself apart as far as possible. And what? Disturbing? You found it disturbing? Do you not find the medical collection of the Antiquarian Museum disturbing?
I found the two together disturbing.
Oh, well, the point was that we were supposed to react to the Antiquarian stuff. It wouldn't really have worked if we'd come on unicycles with a juggling ball.
That would have been good. Let's talk to Catherine then, and talk what we've heard. We've heard what Aaron thought of your piece. What were you trying to achieve?
I think it took me a while to know how to respond. Okay, it took me a while to know how to respond to the Hunterian collection because there was this whole sort of bombardment of medical paraphernalia, and I suppose for me it sort of reminded me of the fear that I have associated with medical intervention. And so I then started to think along those lines, and I mean, so many thoughts came into my head, concerning many, many different issues, but particularly how the medical world is today. And so I sort of thought, well, I want to be quite subversive, and I want the piece to be humorous, but at the same time, I want there to be undertone. And so the idea of dressing up as a guinea pig was to simulate a laboratory sort of space inside the Hunterian Museum, and I think I suppose my piece was about reflecting on how sometimes that our medical intervention isn't always a good thing.
And do you feel, I think, do you feel sometimes that disabled people, I think all of us actually who interact with the medical profession sometimes feel like guinea pigs or like objects?
That's absolutely correct. It wasn't uniquely about disabled people feeling like guinea pigs. It was everybody, all of us, and so that was sort of my starting point. And then I sort of I don't know. My whole process went thinking about all sorts of medical situations that people can find themselves in, particularly, all of us, but obviously in relation to myself and other disabled people. And so I was, like I said, my work does address the medical model of disability, which Erin explained earlier. And to be honest, I did find it quite difficult at the beginning because in my work, I never define my impairment. I never say what my disability is because that isn't the nature of my work unless I wish to parody disability or the medical model of disability and sort of home in on the way in which representation of disability can often be about the medical part of the medical side of the individual as opposed to their personality.
What do you think performing in the Hunterian brought to it, where you've got all these objects?
Well, I think they most certainly elevated the piece. It was an ideal environment to be contained. I think, like I said, it just brought up so many points of reference for me, which is something that informs my work as an artist with a disability. So it made me think about lots of things. And I think, in a way, the Hunterian collection sort of triggered off those thoughts, which made me decide that a guinea pig is possibly where I need to be for this performance in terms of, it was experimental. It was an experimental piece to see how it went.
Do you think that when you deal with the medical profession, do you think knowing that they knowing what you do, does it make them treat you any differently?
Well, they don't know what I do.
Sorry?
They don't know what I do.
They don't? Right.
Not really, no. When I go into hospital, it's a very much communication around the situation that I'm in at that time. So I'm usually in there for them to keep me alive, which is what they do. So I'm very, obviously very pleased about that. But generally, when any of us go into hospital, I don't think there is a dialogue about what do you do outside, what do you do outside of being ill. I think that often we're seen as being permanently ill in that environment, so it's quite hard to actually bring one's personality into a medical hospitalised environment.
Well, thank you. Sam, if I can bring you in, as someone responsible for the environment here, the Hunterian. Particularly the lower floor. I mentioned how disturbing I find this place, particularly the lower floor. It's very much, I suppose we'd say now, in a lot of those cabinets, disabled people as objects.
Very much so. The way to understand museums like ours, very traditional museums, is in terms of their historical pedigree. We're a museum created in the 18th and developed in the 19th century. And 18th and 19th century museums were in the business of classifying. They're engines of difference. Their job was to take in an object, a plant, an animal, a machine, or a person, and to classify them, to put them in a box, to classify them as self or other. And so this classification, which built the current sciences of taxonomy and so forth, this classification has a darker side when you look at the way it pathologizes people. And so historically, museums were in the business of pathologizing people, whether by the place they came from, whether by their color, their gender, or their shape. And what we see in modern museums and what we deal with as curators are the legacies of this prejudice. And I think it behooves us, in medical museums in particular, to look at how these classifications, how these pathologies arose. Because these museums, as engines of difference, were part of the medical machinery that developed models of disability to understand disability as something that needed to be cured. The human remains that came into museums were classified according to norms that had, of course, at the centre, the norm of the European heterosexual white male. And anything that didn't fall into that category was pathologized and put in the other categories. And it's interesting when you look at the history of medical museums, the difference between morbid anatomy and normal anatomy. And very quickly, the morbid anatomy, the pathology, engulfs the normal. There's, one series of normal and dozens of series of pathologies according to the different axes by which you can differ from the norm. So it behooves all museums to combat prejudice, as we're now, engines of good, I'd like to think. But in particular, I think it's especially relevant that medical museums address the way disability is represented and the way disability is framed in the medical community and to our audiences beyond the medical community. And the two ways we can do this. We can do this by providing access, and Jane Hughes, our head of learning events, is very adept in looking at the different ways we can access our material through audio description, through resources for visually impaired people. And that's very exciting projects to work on. And we want to build that into our core offer, which often isn't the case with museums, although London's relatively well served. But other museums can do that, and other museums do that. What we have the opportunity is to look at the lived experience of disability through the material culture we have in the museum, whether that material culture is the prostheses or the equipment or the tools used to construct and purportedly to cure disability, or whether that's the material culture of the human remains, the remains of the people who lived with these disabilities. And I think that's what's interesting about tonight, is the interaction between the contemporary response to these very historical, necessarily historical specimens, and looking at the lived experience from both sides of the glass, I think.
Well, I think we'll come on to that. I think the big question is how much has this changed? But Brian, if I can come to you. Well, my first question is, you deal in medical humanities. What are we talking about here? What do you do?
Well, you can think of medical humanities as a parallel universe to the medical sciences. So just as you have anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, biophysics, and other branches of medicine, so you also have medical ethics, the ways in which medicine is now assessed ethically and governed, regulated, so that medical research is safer, so that it is possibly more democratic and accountable. You have history of medicine, which looks at the evolution of modern understanding of medicine, the ways in which those understandings have changed, not always progressively and not always continuously. And just as you have the interface between ethics and medicine, or history and medicine, there's an interface also between literature and medicine that looks at, for example, the way in which patient experience or the experience of disability was depicted in the past by poets, by novelists, by biographers, to comment on really the experience of illness and the experience between doctors and patients, not always written by patients, sometimes written by novelists, sometimes very distinguished novelists, sometimes written by doctors. There's an interface between philosophy and medicine. Philosophers are interested in the kind of concept that health is, whether health is a natural category or whether it's a human category. Is it part of nature or is it a construction? So the medical humanities are interested in those sorts of questions. They're also interested in the ethics and values behind display, not just display in the sense of visual display that we've seen tonight, but also the ways in which patients are depicted in medical literature. So there's a form of display that can be understood in terms of the ways in which doctors write letters about patients, or the ways in which doctors incorporate aspects of people who are ill or disabled in case histories, and the values behind those depictions. So I would say to you, the medical humanities is a parallel universe to the medical sciences.
Okay,
but it's a human universe, and it's a universe that is not dictated to in scientific terms, but in more human terms.
So with that hat on, what did you make of tonight's performances?
Well, I made several things of it. I felt that Catherine's performance was a very powerful statement of the ways in which doctors can relate to people with serious medical problems in a way that treats them as other, measures them, looks at them, peeps at them, to use Aaron's phrase, that stares at them in a way that doesn't allow them to stare back, that charts them, that observes them, and perhaps even prods and touches them, and in a way that possibly denies them their humanity. I felt that Aaron's performance was absolutely intriguing, because he was, it seemed to me, very much peering back at the specimens, but also through the specimens, through the glass vases and the glass cases, and showing us much more of a living, distorted human visage that was nevertheless very active, very alive, creating tracks, vapor tracks on glass, very much depicting human activity in the context of a rather dead museum. And I could go on with other responses, but perhaps you'd like me to stop, and perhaps you would like to respond to those.
I'd like to.
It's fairly good reading.
To talk that it's the dead objects and the very much alive.
Yeah, there were several things I was thinking about, but identification with specimens was one of the things, but also maybe it being an over-keen visitor to the collection, like I couldn't get close enough to them, so I had to press right up to see them, that sort of thing. But I thought my performance was quite peripheral, really. It was something that might have easily been missed, and a lot of people were walking past me, and I kept having to move place. And in fact, when I attracted too much attention, I was like a shy exhibit, really, where I picked up my stand and moved off and went somewhere else where there wasn't anyone, and then waited for people to come and watch it again. So I was very, very much interested in being a shy exhibit, I suppose.
Catherine, I was struck by what Sam was saying about, we were talking about the disabled people as objects in the museum. And that's really what you're talking about as well with your art, isn't it?
I sort of play with that notion of disabled people being seen as objects. But I try to redefine how people see disabled people. So I sort of mess around with I think people, sort of the general people, are used to seeing disabled people within a medical context, and I think that we talked about how disabled people are written about in medical literature, and so it's very difficult as a disabled person to jump out of that sort of representation that is so rife. And so for me, my work is always trying to defy the medical terminology that is used to describe disabled people per se.
Could I just say, I was very struck by your comment that when you visit a doctor or go into hospital, the people who are caring for you have no idea what you do. And I think that says a great deal, really, about how the healthcare system takes the context of people away, rather like putting them in boxes that takes them out of their the context of their life and work. I'm a medical practitioner myself, and I spend a lot of time asking people about what they do and what matters to them, because it seems to me that if you don't do that as a medical practitioner, you can't really have much of a clue about what's important to the person that you're talking to, what's important to them. And it seems to me that one of the things that arts and performance and medicine has to teach healthcare is of the importance of subjectivity. And I don't mean by subjectivity something that's a will-o'-the-wisp and that doesn't matter, but which is absolutely crucially important to the person who is unwell or ill or is worried. And that can be shown in many ways, but one way in which it can help to be shown is by knowing something about what matters to that person.
And I suppose what we're talking about here could be applied to, we're not just talking about people with disabilities, we're talking about anyone. This equally applies to anyone.
Absolutely, it applies to me when I go and see my own doctor or when I am seen in hospital. The capacity to strip away context, the importance of seeing beyond the biological is absolutely crucial to retaining connection with humanity. And I thought what was so powerful about your piece, Catherine, was that it demands a response to what you might think of as difference and strangeness, which calls upon human resources and human responses. I mean, one of the things that's striking about this museum is not just the specimens, but also the paintings. If you go into the little gallery at the end, I think it was sort of next to the pay bar, you will find pictures, as an 18th century picture of a young girl called Sabina, who's a piebald girl, who was born in South America, I think. And next to her is a rhinoceros, and next to that is a kangaroo, and next to that is Daniel Lambert, and next to that are a series of dwarfs. And just the idea that these differences can somehow be represented together as in any sense some sort of a series, it seems to me, has to be challenged. We have to be able to say, no, these are not similar kinds of differences. These are radically different alterities, and they should not be put together in the 21st century.
Okay, Sam. It's your museum. And I think the point really here is that it's how much has changed. Are we still doing the same thing, treating whether it's disabled people or just patients as objects?
I think the thing to note is that, in truth, the Hunterian isn't a medical museum, it's a medical history museum. We're capturing a mindset in the 18th and 19th centuries, and, as Brian knows well, he's being deliberately provocative. We're framing the intellectual, social and political world of John Hunter, whose collection you find on that ground floor. And that's why the things are together. So they're gathered together not by kind of pathology, they're gathered together actually along aesthetic lines. We have in the college a true medical museum, if it were, which is a training collection of the surgeons. There it's gathered by clinical use, which is a very different use for a collection, and it's a very different function, and they're very different audiences, of course.
But if I can come on to the broader point here, do you feel, as someone who's studied the history of the way disabled people are portrayed, that has actually changed? The medical profession has changed the way disabled people are portrayed, or even patients are portrayed?
It's my view that both the medical profession and the museum profession has changed the way that disabled people are represented in their practices. It's also my view that we and they are continuing to change and do need to continue to change.
Aaron, if I can... Oh, Catherine. To you, is that something you feel? Or, you know, you were dressed there as a guinea pig. I guess not.
Do you have to put me on this one? Yeah, I mean, I agree with... I agree with... Sorry, I don't know your name. The person at the end.
Brian. Yeah.
Brian, I really think he's actually pinpointed something quite key in that you're putting the paintings of animals and human in the same space is absolutely outrageous. If one thinks about it, I know that when I came here, it was a very fleeting visit, and I really didn't have a good chance to absorb everything. But I was disturbed as somebody living in the 21st century that I was having to look at specific paintings of people with dwarfism, and I don't think this is helpful to people living today, because this museum is open to the public and they're going to see images of difference. And, you know, where does that leave us that are living in today's society? Where does that leave me? It's just basically a mirror reflect. You know, it's rather, it's disturbing, to say the least. It's disturbing. And I don't know whether I don't believe it is helpful to have such images on display for the public to see within that context.
I mean, you're in a tricky position here, aren't you? Because it's almost a museum of museums, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. I feel very passionately that it is helpful, that to understand the representation and the construction of difference, we need to see it through a historical lens, to understand why the current differences that are being broken down between male and female, between different ethnicities, between different body shapes. We need to understand the historical construction of that difference. And museums were key parts. They might not be such spaces for intellectual development now. Many are simply reflections of what's going on. But knowledge was constructed in museums. And by presenting an 18th century collection in a way similar to the way it was developed and constructed. I mean, we do this explicitly by showing pictures of Hunter's house and the way it was originally collected. We demonstrate how notions of difference were constructed historically in the 18th century in this particular case.
I mean, I'd like to move on before we get too tied into the museum. Come back to the performances if we can. I mean, maybe there'll be some more questions later. But Brian, I suppose, what's the value of these sorts of performances in this setting?
Well, I believe the value of these sorts of occasions are to celebrate, to show and to celebrate the agency of people who may feel misrepresented or not represented at all within the medical universe, and to represent their creativity and their imaginative capacities and their desire to dialogue with medicine and healthcare today, and to help healthcare practitioners envision responses to their situations that are not governed and not dominated by stereotypes, particularly out-of-date stereotypes that are damaging to those who are ill or disabled or unwell. And as Sam was saying, this does apply not only to the very visibly disabled, but also to those who are just ill, frankly.
Do you feel, Aaron, that this brings you closer to the medical profession, that it improves the understanding the medical profession has?
I very rarely go to the doctors, and I gave up going to have my hearing loss measured many years ago. So I don't really have a relation to the medical profession, but what I do have is something akin or an affinity with this idea of objectifying people who live their lives differently, who abnormally, and all of the things that the Antiquarian collection lyrically spells out. And I personally find it quite enthralling and liberating to go through a process where those experiences are objectified so much that individuals end up in specimen drawers and are gawked at by the public forever and ever after. And I think that process of objectification is in some ways more valuable than the kind of polite prejudices that is the normal experiences of disabled people in everyday life. So I don't take any offence at the collection at all. I think it's quite liberating, and often when we make art together, we have a very dark, black humour about each other, and for me, the Antiquarian collection fits right in with all of that. But I don't think that I don't know whether the museum itself really puts the emphasis on having kind of grand Guignol atmosphere to it, but it can't help but have so, I think.
Do you think, I mean, I could talk about, being a patient as an object. Do you think it's more powerful if you, as someone who's disabled, talks about the patient as an object? Does that make a difference?
The thing is, I don't think there's a demarcation line between disability and normality. It's something everyone can look forward to eventually anyway. I mean, you're all going to fall apart, And so anybody who sort of puts me in a box where I'm meant to be radically different from them is really missing the point. The question is not your self-image so much as how much that self-image is controlled by narratives of dominant narratives of society that are funded and paid for by public commission. And in that sense, one can take issue with if the medical profession continued to objectify disabled people. But as Brian so eloquently was describing, everything's improved in the years that I've lived. But I think what Catherine was interested in and making very active about with the question of assisted suicide, for example, is very much like a condensation of all of these debates, whereby if the medical profession pulls its weight behind the provision of assisted suicide, then I think it really needs to question the wisdom of that.
Yeah,
Catherine?
I agree. I think, we might be going off track here, but, legalising assisted suicide in this country is something that disabled people, the disabled community and people who are terminally ill, etc., really do fear. And my argument would be that in these cases, although I'm sure there are many medical practitioners who do not support assisted suicide. The point is that the medical journals that describe somebody with illness or disability will be used in the court of justice, and there will not be text that argues that the person has a good quality of life. And so that might be a different argument. But these are concerns that I have, and I think they're very important.
Well, it's perhaps the extension of the same argument from people as objects. So let's have some questions. We've talked about the performances. We've talked about disabled people as objects against the objects in the museum. We've come on to assisted suicide. So some questions. Please wait till the microphone is with you. And right at the back, first of all.
Hello. I wanted to follow on from Catherine's point about the collection at the museum. I have to say I find it really interesting, and I definitely want to come back and explore it further. But on the note of it's a historical representation of the medical science at that time, similarly, would it be acceptable if I wanted to set up a circus freak show looking at sort of, representing how that used to be, and how do you separate the two?
Sam?
Well, I mean, there are many representations in media and television and so on of historical circuses and freak shows and so on. What we have here is the inherited material culture of an 18th century collection, and it's constructed, the ground floor part of the museum, it's very much constructed as how the 18th century surgeon, anatomist, naturalist saw the world, and is explicitly stated and framed as that. The upper floor tells a slightly different narrative. So I think that you know about, sorry, you've sat down again, that you know about 18th, 19th century freak shows, circuses and so on is because of these representations. If it was constructing perhaps Hunter's hospital ward, had he had a hospital ward, if it was constructing the hospital ward with the living, perhaps we might be having a different sort of conversation.
Anyone else like to come in on?
Lots of people want to ask questions.
Yeah, so let's have another question. Let's have one from the front here, this lady here.
I suppose, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on your performances. I've spent an awful lot of time drawing in this museum, I think probably about 5 years, and pretty regularly, nearly every day. I'm also an artist who has very complicated unseen disability that affects every day of my life. And firstly, I would like to congratulate the museum. I think you're stepping forward by doing this event and by actually looking at the collection in a very different way. And probably I'd have a lot more arguments if you weren't, but you are taking it forward into the 21st century. I've got an awful lot of issues that I'd like to deal with tonight.
Do you have a question?
From a medical point of view and lots of other ways. I still think this is the one question that's never been answered. This whole issue about how medicine sees disability and the humanity and the levels of how people view people with disabilities. And the only thing I could probably ask is, the question I have to ask is how many people in the audience come from a medical background.
It was funny you should say that, because it was something I wanted to ask.
And that's my really biggest issue, because I would probably suggest that there aren't many.
Are there any doctors, nurses, surgeons in the audience here? Well, there's one on the panel, and there are three in the.
For our key performance indicators, if you could indicate if you're a member or fellow of the college, that would be great.
So that counts.
I look forward to a time when we have an event like this, and
So that was my question.
Yeah.
I look forward to a time when we have an event like this when our audience involves not only artists, the artistically inclined and the wonderful diverse people that you are with your many different interests, but also a healthier smattering of our key stakeholder.
And my answer would be, until we get all of those people here, we're never going to break through.
And Brian, if, you may talk to your patients, you may take an interest in your patients, you may know what they do. I would suggest you are in the minority.
I think you may be right. I think, in a sense, whether I'm in the minority or not is not really the main issue. It's a question of where we're trying to get to. And I think that the question of the objectification is obviously a central concern here, and it's a concern that operates across medicine and healthcare at many different levels. One way forward might be to accept, of course, Sam's point that this is a museum of a historical collection, and that absolutely gives it a historical status and a historical validity of its own. We cannot rewrite history, although we may wish to reinterpret it. And there may be a case for thinking about an exhibition of some parts of the gallery that would have new captions. Many of the captions on the exhibits and on the paintings, some of them are 18th and 19th century, but some of them are clearly 20th century. And so there are constant reinterpretations of these exhibits taking place over time. So it is a historical collection, but it's a collection with an accretion of different levels of interpretation and commentary. And it may be that there's a case of saying that we should have an exhibition with a 21st century set of commentaries, some of which might be written by people in the audience and by some of the artists.
So should we have a question? There's a person at the back with a sheet of paper.
Excuse me. There's obviously been a change. It's difficult for a lot of people to evaluate it, but medicine has definitely moved on, certainly in the last 20 years, in terms of looking at the patient rather than the difficulty. But the thing that interests me is the conflict between the medical model and the social model of disability, and of course the administrative model, which is very politicized and moves very, very quickly. Namely, there's nothing wrong with you, go and go to the workhouse. But the issue with the two conflicting models of disability, that medicine is changing, but with the social model is they're disabling us, and with the medical model is that they are disabled. How do you evaluate, or this is just an open question to the entire panel, how do you then establish what excellence is, particularly from disabled artists?
Aaron, would you like to?
Say again.
If you just repeat the end of your question, please.
Yes, it's with the conflict between the ping pong between being disabled by society, or society, medicine deciding that you are disabled by your inabilities or disabilities. Then where is
evaluate excellence?
How do we establish where excellent is?
Oh. Yeah. How do we evaluate artistic excellence? Yeah. I think. Yeah. Who's asking that?
You put your hand up again if you're asking that question.
Hello. It's a very good question, and it's what we're all trying to build towards, really. I've been working in disability art for many years, and when I first encountered disability art, I was very much involved with representation in the mainstream about getting disabled actors onto television soap operas or in Hollywood films and all of that kind of thing. And that was a very valid premise, but it led to a lot of really dreadful art being given a lot of public funding, which was basically just cabaret or very simplistic, non-formally interesting art. And so it's quite a new development, really, which is why I've been invited to curate here today, is that I'm interested in formally innovative art, but I'm also passionately convinced about all of the political claims of the social model of disability. And I want to do, as a curator, it's my prerogative and objective, try and create a connection between the two things. And, well, I don't want to blow my horn too loudly, but I think it's a comparatively new thing.
So, excellent question. Let's have another excellent question. Someone else got a question? Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm sitting here bubbling over with impatience, and I'm so sorry about that. I really, really thought that the events this evening were fantastic. I love the work. I'm really, really impressed that the Hunterian is open to it. My concern, Brian, is with you, and that is that what we have is a series of presentations which I think really demonstrate very clearly the dis-ease with which the medical profession regards the patients, and especially if we're disabled. And I think this has to be deconstructed down to a power imbalance. It has to come down to power. And I don't think Siobhan could have said it any more clearly by looking at power. And what I don't hear is I do not hear a response about how the medical profession overall is actually challenging itself on the really quite appalling power imbalance that it holds, and how it can stop itself from becoming a vehicle for, say, for example, for the government to assess whether or not we have a right to full benefits and therefore fully independent living. And I think we need to be asking these questions, Brian, and I think we have to be doing it with real insight and with real passion.
So this power imbalance between disabled people and the medical profession.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I wanted to go on to say that the painting of the piebald girl, the South American girl, described the skin condition and then immediately said, and this is a congenital condition. So a description of the girl, and then this is a congenital condition, which is clearly a 20th century remark. And that is an attempt to immediately, you evoke a great anxiety. What is this piebald condition? What does it mean? Who may suffer from it? Is it infectious? I don't know what the anxieties were in the 18th century. But what is so striking about the way the painting is presented is that it's presented as an exemplification of knowledge. We know what it is, it's congenital. And I think that the anxiety that disability and illness provokes and evokes, even today in the medical profession, is something that is not well recognized and is responded to through this profound attempt to classify, to name, to box, to put in order. And that is a power relationship. It's a power relationship with anxiety and fear. There is another power relationship operating in the medical profession between the government and the medical profession as an organised body. And that power relationship is actually the other way round. The medical profession is the weaker party, quite clearly so, and has been so for many decades, and is not, in my view, fully representing the needs and rights of disabled people, whether they be visibly disabled, functionally disabled, or psychologically disabled. And that is a very major problem.
So that doesn't necessarily answer your question. We've got time for one more question. And I think just this lady at the front here. I want to make sure I don't miss anyone.
Yeah.
Sorry, this gentleman at the front.
It's actually, the question's not for me, it's for my friend.
Okay.
Louise beside me.
Yeah, sure.
But it might be a good sort of rounding off question, but it's really just wanted to find out a bit more about Hunter himself, what kind of person he was, and also how his museum was viewed at the time in the 18th century.
That would perhaps be a good way to end, actually, when we've talked about the performances and what happens now, set it in the context of Hunter.
What kind of person he was, beyond a doctor.
He was Scottish.
Thanks.
He was a very angry man. He was viewed with some suspicion. He was viewed with some trepidation by lay audiences, if one can talk about that. He was came to be revered by the surgical profession. I'm trying to think of the most relevant aspects of Hunter's work to end with tonight. And I can't think quite of what... Yeah, please.
One of the things about Hunter, which it's also important to realise, is that his interest went beyond the human to the animal, to geology, to fossils, to the various other, what you might call specimens of the natural world. And he was very involved in placing what we consider the human within the broader context of a chain of natural objects. So he became president of the Royal Society, I think, did he not? Perhaps he didn't, perhaps I got that wrong. But he was very involved in things that beyond human surgery, human anatomy, to other forms of specimen and objectification. So I think it's important to see the issues of objectification go beyond simply medicine and human anatomy. They also involve animal medicine and animal health and animal anatomy, and arguably some people would say, to plant species. So this is a very big issue that goes across the whole of the sort of 18th and 19th century sciences of nature and of humans.
Well, before we finish, I'll let Aaron have the final word on our discussion.
Yeah, very quickly I want to respond to Sam and Brian, which is obviously, it's very difficult to understand the historical relativism behind John Hunter's programme. But what we've been left with here is an incredible collection of things. And whereas he may have been a very dour Scottish man he wouldn't really want to share a parent with, he was a seeker and he was curious and he left us with all these incredible things. I think that what we're reflecting on now is the 21st century responses to, 20th century, if truth be told, responses to John Hunter and his programme. And I don't have any problem at all trying to understand, connect with what the 18th century premises were, which I think were probably more to do with poetry, mystery, and the unknown, rather than all of the things we expect from a museum collection today.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd just like to thank all our performers this evening and the panel here, Aaron, Catherine, Sam and Brian. Before we finish, I'd like to mention that as part of the Specimens to Superhumans programme, Shape and the Arts Catalysts are looking at ways to work more closely with disabled artists interested in issues around science and bioethics, many of the issues that have been raised tonight. So if you are a disabled artist, you know a disabled artist to be interested, you can grab Emma from Shape, who's at the door, who is waving by the door now on the way out. Also, I'd be grateful if you fill in any the feedback forms. You can also hand them to Emma at the door or anyone else you find near the door, or leave them by the door. I should also thank Laura Cream and Jane Hughes, who've been heavily involved in organising tonight's event. And thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the labyrinth of living exhibits. Thank you.